Hey everyone, this is Mauricio Rauld and you're watching episode 1 of the Real Estate Syndication Q&A show. Or maybe it's episode 1 of the Ask Mauricio show. I haven't quite figured out what to call this thing, but I really wanted to get this thing going. If you've got any suggestions of which one's better, I'd love your feedback in the comments. But super pumped about this. I've been meaning to do this show for quite a while, way before COVID, and just time and everything didn't work out. But dedicated to doing the show now, and it's meant to be a Q&A of anything really in terms of syndications, but definitely real estate syndication, which is obviously my forte. So without further ado, let's go into the first question, which comes from Scott H, and he asks, do I need to share the names of all of the other LP investors in the PPM docs? Do I need to share the names of all of the other LP investors in the PPM docs? And that's a great question, Scott, and the answer is yeah. I know that's not a popular answer. I get this quite a bit, but think about it. One of the things that your limited investors can do is call for meetings, call for votes. I know that's very limited rights, but there are scenarios where they do get the opportunity and the right to call a vote, and the only way they can do that is by giving each other notice, legal notice of a particular meeting or a particular vote. And so if they don't have each other's name and contact information and their voting percentage, so they know how many votes they have, then how are they going to pull out that kind of a vote? And so just from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to make sure that your operating agreement, which is usually where you're going to find this information, in our operating agreements in Exhibit 1 or Exhibit A, lists all of the members' names, all of the addresses, and all of the percentage interest. Now, I know the pushback I get is privacy, right? The investors don't want to share that information. And my response to that is, look, if the limited partner cares that much about their privacy, then they should set it up properly from the beginning. They should go out and set up their own LLC. Don't use your personal name and your personal address if you want privacy. Have them go set up an LLC in a private state like a Wyoming, and get your anonymity that way, and use a PO box or whatever. So the investor has the mechanism by which they can get the privacy. It's not really our job as a syndicator to provide that for them. And as I mentioned earlier, just from a practical standpoint, it makes sense to list all of them. And then a second reason is most of the states, I've looked at a few before answering this question, but most of the states actually require, as part of the LLC statute, that you maintain a list of all the members, the addresses, and the percentage ownership, and that be shared with the investors upon request. Usually you've got some time, 5 days or 10 days, usually at their expense, but they do have the right to request all of the books and records of the company, and one of those is that list. So those are probably the two main reasons I would say that you always want to list that. And then there's always, if you've got non-accredited investors, then the issue also becomes, hey, is it a material fact to list all the other members and their percentages so that everybody knows who's in there, and it's not just you and your family or your close relatives in the deal. So because of all those things, the answer is yes, make sure that you list all of your investors' names, contact information, and percentage interest. All right, so the next one comes to us and says, for a syndication, are the members of the GP team considered accredited investors for that deal only, and if so, why? For a syndication, are the members of the GP team considered accredited investors for that deal only, and if so, why? I would actually challenge the first assumption that the members of the GP are accredited. And I know it's important because sometimes you're doing raises where only accredited investors are eligible, and so the question becomes, is the GP, or the GP members, do they need to be accredited? And the answer to that is actually found in the definition itself, Rule 501, and maybe we can throw the definition up, and it basically says, any director, and it basically says any accredited investor means any director, executive officer, or general partner of the issuer, and the issuer is the syndication LLC, which in our world would never happen because we always have a management company or a GP entity that actually is the manager of the syndication LLC. So it's very rare to see an individual be the manager. So that wouldn't apply. But going back to the definition, or any director, executive officer, or general partner of a general partner of the issuer. Now that one's going to be our usual scenario because the manager is going to have members of that management, and it's going to have managers of that management. And according to the rule, you have to be a manager of the manager to be an accredited investor, or some kind of an executive officer or director, meaning you have actual decision-making authority, an executive authority to make decisions. And if you're just a member and not a manager, you're not going to be qualified as an accredited investor for purposes, for numerous purposes, but most likely the most common one is whether you're eligible to be involved in the 506C deal, or a deal that only allows accredited investors. So that's number one. And then the second question, which is would that only apply to that particular deal? And the answer would be yes, because as you can see, the language of the statute has to do with the issuer, and the issuer, again, it just means a syndication LLC, and usually we create different syndication LLCs for each individual deal. And so just because you're an accredited investor for one particular issuer doesn't mean that the next syndication, you're also going to be that as well. The last question comes to us from Russell G, and he says, are PPMs always required? When are they, and when are they not? Great question. Generally speaking, it depends on, number one, the type of exemption that you're going after, and number two, the type of investors you're going after. So typically a PPM is not required when you're offering your syndication to accredited investors only. If they're accredited investors only, then you actually get to decide what disclosures, what information you get to give those accredited investors. Now, those disclaimers and disclosures need to be complete. We need to abide by the anti-fraud provision, so it's usually impossible to provide them with some type of information and not give them any disclosures. But you don't have to do a full-blown PPM. You want to just make sure you give them, making sure whatever statements, your pitch deck or whatever communications are complete, and you balance those disclosures. But a full-blown PPM is not going to be required if you have accredited investors only. When it's required is when you have non-accredited investors. So a 506B, for example, that has non-accredited investors, anytime you have even one non-accredited investor, you are required to provide them with the highest level of disclosures around, which is going to be the PPM, the private placement memorandum. Now, there's one other exemption that we don't usually talk about, which is Rule 504. And in Rule 504, and this is one of the misnomers out there, in Rule 504, you can raise up to, I think they just updated it to $10 million without the necessity of a PPM. However, most people don't use 504 because when you do that, when you use 504, it doesn't preempt the states. That means that you still have to comply with all the state securities laws. So yes, you're okay at the federal level, but if you've got investors in California, Texas, and Florida, well, you've got to go hire an attorney in those three states and make sure you're abiding by those securities laws, which is one of the reasons almost no one that I know of uses Rule 504 unless everybody's contained in one state and they just go after that particular state. So anyway, hopefully that's been helpful for you guys. If you've got a question, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for content. I'm looking forward to this series, see how it goes, and we'll see you at the next one.